and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Edge. Long lines and traffic jams plague the Cottonwood Canyons. And our guest today is Josh Van Jura, Utah Department of Transportation Project Manager, the Little Cottonwood Canyon Environmental Impact Study. Josh, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We're delighted to have you. Josh, give us an idea. What is the basic problem with, I guess it's called State Route 210, or more commonly called the Little Cottonwood Canyon Road? What's the problem with all the traffic?
Sure. So there's three main problems that Little Cottonwood Canyon and Wasatch Boulevard, that is part of SR 210, regularly see, right? So there's a safety component, a mobility component, and a reliability component. Safety is a part of everything that UDOT does. And so this project's no different. And the two main safety hazards in the canyon are, one, the avalanche hazard index. As you're probably aware, Little Cottonwood Road is the most dangerous avalanche road in North America.
That's what I've been told.
But there's also a roadside parking problem. If you've been up there on a busy day, you see everybody parking on the shoulder, and these people then become pedestrians, often walking in the lanes. So those are the two components of the safety problem. But then there's also a congestion problem, right? You alluded to 2+ hour waits that are fairly common on weekends, holidays, and powder days.
Powder days, absolutely.
And powder days. But Wasatch Boulevard also has a congestion problem, with traffic expected to increase by 45% by 2050. So again, we have those backing days, and that's our mobility problem. But with a 2-hour delay, you have a reliability problem. Because as you know, many people want to be there by that 9 o'clock start of the lifts.
Of course.
And if you don't know if it's going to take you 21 minutes or 2+ hours, that really factors into your travel time. So we really want to increase those three components: safety, mobility, and reliability.
So is this traffic issue limited to just Little Cottonwood Canyon, or is it all the canyons that have a similar traffic issue?
So many canyons do experience those similar, ski resort canyons experience that same mobility and reliability problems associated with the opening and closing of lifts. But like I said, Little Cottonwood's a little bit unique because it does have that really high avalanche danger, which results in roughly 56 hours of closure per season over a 20-year average.
So Josh, is this a particular time of year problem, winter, summer, or year-round?
So we definitely see large volumes of traffic both in the summer and in the winter, but it is primarily a winter problem. And that's because people are trying to get up for the opening of the lift and then coming down after the closing of the lift, of course.
Of course.
While in summer, people are a little more dispersed in their times, right? There's people that get up early trying to beat the heat. And then there's the people that go for a hike after lunch or sunset. So again, we really see those concentrated flows mostly in the winter, and that's what creates those peaks.
Is this a problem faced by all the ski areas in Utah, or is that kind of unique to the greater Salt Lake area?
So I think this is a pretty common problem. I mean, Snow Basin, certainly Big Cottonwood experiences this as well. And again, it's really surrounding that opening and closing of the lift. But what makes Little Cottonwood unique is that avalanche hazard index and the closures associated with that.
Of course. Can you give us an idea, just roughly, what the car count is on a busy day going up Little Cottonwood Canyon?
So the busiest days that we've seen over the past couple years have about 7,000 vehicles per day. 7,000
per day.
But
so that's up and back.
So that's 7,000 combined.
Yes.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, up and back.
Going up and coming
Correct.
back. That's a lot of traffic for a small highway like that.
2-lane rural mountainous road. And that's why we see that congestion, because honestly, the road is over capacity today. But if you take in the growth projections that Utah is expected to have in the next 30 years. But looking forward in 2050, we expect those 7,000 plus vehicle days to be roughly 50 days a year. And that's 50 days out of a 140-day ski season.
Mm-hmm.
So that's roughly every Saturday, Sunday, holiday, and those random Tuesday powder days.
Do the other canyons, Big Cottonwood, for example, have a similar traffic load?
They do. They get a very similar traffic count to Little Cottonwood. And again, it's that avalanche hazard that really compounds.
So it's actually a twofold problem. It's Little Cottonwood Canyon and Big Cottonwood Canyon at some point in the future. How long have you been studying this issue?
So our project started back in the spring of 2018. So we're a little over 3 years into it. But the canyons have been studied for years, right? Over the past 30 years, there's actually been a dozen plus traffic studies done on the canyon.
Similar conclusions?
Varying conclusions and varying scopes. But we obviously started with all of that information.
Of course.
And familiarized ourselves with all those previous studies when we started back in the spring of 2018.
Indeed. Well, it seems like all studies have to have some sort of a basis, a foundation, a criteria. Give us an idea of what the central criteria is for this particular study.
So again, we really looked at what the problem is in the canyon. That's how we really arrived at our reliability, mobility, and safety goal.
So essentially the problem is just traffic, period. Volumes of traffic.
Absolutely.
Did the public, or has the public had an opportunity to provide input?
Very much so. So we've had 3 distinct comment periods. We just finished our comment period on the draft EIS that was released this summer. And all told, we've had over 20,000 comments from the public, which is phenomenal.
For the most part, positive contributions versus just negative comments?
There's a good mix in all honesty, but we need that, right? Public input is vital to the success of this project.
Indeed.
And while we've put in thousands of hours looking at it, just having all these perspectives really helps us understand the users of the canyon's needs and also what the problems associated with the canyon really are.
How about the ski resorts? Have you looked to them for advice, counsel, recommendations?
So the ski resorts have provided comment on the draft EIS, and those will be available and everybody can read them as part of the comments when they're released.
Do their ideas vary greatly from some of the early conclusions that maybe UDOT has made?
So they're actually their preferred, and again, you can see this in their public comment, is they are in support of the gondola option, which is one of the 2 preferred alternatives that was identified in the draft.
So at this point, UDOT has come up with some specific recommendations.
Absolutely.
Can you just kind of outline those to us?
Sure. So in the draft EIS, we analyzed the environmental impacts of 5 separate alternatives. So we had an enhanced bus alternative with no roadway widening. We had an enhanced bus option with peak period shoulder lanes, essentially a shoulder running bus. We had a gondola that left from the existing Little Cottonwood Park and Ride right there at the mouth. And then we added 2 options at our draft alternative stage last summer based on public comment. One of which was a gondola from North Little Cottonwood Road. We call this gondola B. A lot of people have been referring it to as gondola from Lakai. And then also a cog rail from Lakai. And we ran all the impacts on these 5 alternatives. And in the draft EIS, we did identify the enhanced bus with peak period shoulder lanes and gondola B departing from North Little Cottonwood Road as the 2 options that best met the project's purpose and need.
So will you, in terms of procedure, offer these 3 or 4 options to whoever the decision makers are, or is that UDOT? Is UDOT the ultimate decision maker?
So UDOT is the ultimate decision maker.
Okay.
And again, based on the public comments we've received, the environmental impacts, and what alternative best fulfills those three goals, safety, mobility, and reliability, in the end, we will choose a single selected alternative.
And you and your staff will submit that to the decision makers in UDOT with a specific recommendation.
Correct.
And then they will either say yes or no.
Correct.
Is that
Hopefully they'll say yes, because that means we
sure.
did a good job.
How about the cities? There are a number of cities that have a vested interest. Have they provided input to any
They
level?
have. So we've received lots of input from the neighboring cities, everybody from Cottonwood Heights to the town of Alta, Sandy, Salt Lake County, Salt Lake City, and they've all provided public input. And I really appreciate all the time that the city staff and the mayors have taken into reviewing the draft EIS and providing these comments that honestly just help UDOT come to that correct decision.
Are there any particular consistencies from city to city, bus, tram, rail, etc.?
So to be honest, there isn't.
Everyone kind of has their own thought.
Correct.
Their own approach.
And that's kind of how UDOT got to two preferred alternatives, which is a little unique because we just think of the term preferred alternatives, right?
Mm-hmm.
The bus option meets the mobility goal much better, but the gondola option meets the reliability goal better. So it really comes down to which of those two goals do you rank in higher regard relatively. So we have seen a lot of variation between those two.
So the rail is kind of a third runner-up, so to speak, at this point, or?
So the rail does have some unique unique positives compared to the other two. But in all honesty, the travel time is similar to the gondola. So it isn't particularly better in the mobility goal.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, which both are slower than the bus.
Mm-hmm.
And in the reliability goal, right? So it just really isn't ahead in any individual category relative to the bus or the gondola at this point.
Does weather play a role in which option may be best? I could see some wind and maybe icing issues associated with the gondola or the tram, and maybe some snow issues associated with the train. Now, it'd have to be a cog train, correct?
Correct.
A conventional train has a limited degree of incline, I understand.
Correct.
So is a cog train more expensive to?
A cog train was the most expensive of the 5 alternatives that we explored. But you're right, all the alternatives do have some weather concerns.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, we modeled our travel times based on dry pavement for the bus option. Because you can't, figure out different snowfall rates, pavement temperatures, humidity rates, right? There's a million options.
Of course, yeah. Did you say that Alta and Snowbird has sort of a preference? Can you share that with us?
Sure. Publicly, they have come out in support of the gondola B option.
Okay. And what would be the number of cars, if that's what you call them, or containers, on a tram?
So
it seems like there'd have to be hundreds of them in order to facilitate any degree of people movement.
So this gondola is a little bit different than what you might be envisioning, whether that be the gondola at Park City Mountain Resort, or many people are familiar with the Telluride gondola. And those are kind of your standard single cable 6 to 8 person cabins. So the 3S system that we're looking at is more similar. The closest one is in Whistler, British Columbia. It does hold 35 people. That's 24 seated and 11 standing. And we're anticipating a cabin arriving every 2 minutes. So 35 people per cabin is actually really similar to what the UTA bus service today carries at 42 passengers per cabin. So again, it's actually quite close and larger than you anticipate. And just for size-wise, Snowbird's tram holds 125 people. So again, just
but
to kind
we're
of
like
bracket,
sardines.
35 will be tight, yes.
Yes.
24 seated, much more comfortable.
Absolutely. It seems like regardless of the option, there has to be a massive parking facility to accommodate the volumes of people that wish to ski, particularly on a fresh powder day.
Absolutely.
So does that require land acquisition?
Potentially. So we are looking at parking for roughly 2,500 vehicles in all of the 5 options. Now, how that's distributed is a little bit different within the individual alternatives. So in the bus option, we would have 1,500 stalls at the gravel pit, just north of Big Cottonwood Road. Obviously, that's privately held currently. And then we would have another 1,000 stalls at the existing UTA Park and Ride at 9,400 South and Highland. On the gondola option, would actually have 1,500 stalls right at the gondola base station. And that is land that UDOT does not currently own. And then would have 600 stalls at the gravel pit and 400 stalls at 9,400 South and Highland.
Just based on some of the numbers we've talked about, if there are 7,000 cars going up on a heavy day, and there's 2,500 to 3,000 parking spaces, it sounds like there's still a challenge for several thousand potential parkers.
So the way we came up with that 2,500 is a 2-lane mountainous road like this can really handle about 1,000 vehicles per hour. And once you exceed that, the mobility really breaks down, and it breaks down quickly. So our goal was to get that 2,050 vehicles per hour count down to about 1,000. And so that's how we came up with a roughly 30% reduction. And that equals the number of parking spots. And we also recognize that taking any transit alternative doesn't work for every person, right? There's families with multiple young children. There are people who are on vacation in large groups. There's the Snowbird ski team, right? That go up with multiple pairs of skis. So we know that we need the road for various users. But again, getting that 30% diversion was our goal to make sure that the capacity of the lane is stable.
So obviously then cars will still be allowed to drive up on their own.
Correct.
This is just a highly recommended alternative.
So that's true. Cars will still be a viable option. I think it's important to note, though, that we are looking at tolling under all 5 of the alternatives to help that transition to one of these transit modes. And we're only anticipating tolling during those peak times.
Too early to give us an idea what that toll might be?
So it will be variable. Which
based on volume?
Correct.
Peak times?
It is anticipated that during the peak times, based on the studies that have been done to date, that toll will likely be in the $20 to $30 per day range. If we have much better acceptance of any of the transit alternatives, that'll likely go down. If we don't have acceptance, that may go up. And that's that variability.
Can you estimate at this point what the cost of the tram would be versus the train versus the bus?
So we do not know that yet, and that hasn't been decided. I will say that the operation and maintenance costs for each of the alternative assumes 0 fare box collection, right? So it's fully covered. Now, a 0 fare box collection, that's not for the EIS to decide. That's for our policymakers. As you're probably well aware, a bus ride today is subsidized, and it's $4.50 each way last season. So the toll or the price of any of the transit alternatives has to be commensurate with the price of that toll.
I see.
If it's more
Okay.
expensive to take the option than it is to drive your car, why would you drive your car?
Of course, indeed. Well, speaking of cost, can you give us an idea what the total cost of each of these options are, particularly the tram and the train?
Sure. So the price of the enhanced bus option with the shoulder widening is an initial cost of $510 million,
Mm-hmm.
and it has a yearly operation and maintenance cost of $11 million. So this is everything from bus driver hours to oil changes and tires to plowing additional roadway width.
All in.
The gondola option has an initial capital cost of $592 million, but it has an operation and maintenance cost of $7.6 million. So roughly $3.4 million less per year.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously this covers the cost of, the people operating the gondola, but also the bus system to get people from those remote mobility hubs to the gondola base.
Mm-hmm. So Josh, what about the cost of the train? Can you estimate that for us at this point?
So the estimated cost of the train and the alternative that the department developed has an initial cost of $1.1 billion, and it has a yearly operation and maintenance cost of $7 million. So it does have a higher initial, a little bit lower on the O&M cost. And that's really a factor of the infrastructure that's needed.
Indeed. How would you fund this? Where would these millions of dollars come from?
So I'm going to say, thankfully, that is outside the scope of the EIS.
Okay.
Our goal is to figure out what the best alternative is based on the facts. Finding funding is the responsibility of policymakers.
Okay. I understand. Give us an idea when construction might start on one of the alternatives.
So it's estimated that construction will take 2 to 3 summers. And again, that's a little bit dependent on which alternative is chosen and how heavy of a winter we have during those periods. But I think it's important to note that, like I mentioned, funding has not been identified to date. And I think that's fair because we don't know what the best alternative is yet, and we haven't really navigated the process.
Mm-hmm.
But once we've identified a selected preferred, we would have roughly a year of design and then 2 to 3 years of construction.
Is the majority of that land state or federal property?
So it's a little bit of everything, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
There are multiple parcels that are privately owned, including the gravel pit. Also, there's some little widenings on Wasatch that may impact private residences.
Mm-hmm.
A majority of the land in the canyon, however, is Forest Service land, so federally owned.
And they're part of this process, I would assume. And
absolutely.
Does the Forest Service have a preferred improvement option?
So they have not identified one. We did receive comments. They are a cooperating agency, so they've been heavily involved since the beginning. But in their comments on the draft EIS, they did not identify a preferred from their purview.
Given the size of this project and the massive amount of work and dollars invested, how do you measure the environmental impact to that specific area? My guess is there would probably be a lot of public concern about changing the views and the general environment of Little Cottonwood Canyon.
Absolutely. So the National Environmental Policy Act, the process that we're following, NEPA, says that we should look at roughly 27 different criteria, right? And that's everything from water quality. As we know, Little Cottonwood provides water to almost 500,000 residents in the valley. So that's hugely important, to visual impacts like you mentioned, noise, socioeconomic impacts associated with tolling. So again, we've taken a really robust look. And honestly, that's why our document is almost 1,400 pages, is because we have looked at all those criteria for each of the 5 alternatives.
So the conclusion is that you can make one of the changes and have a very small environmental impact to the specific area.
Correct.
Is there one that would have a greater impact than the other? I'm guessing the train, but...
So they all have different impacts, I would say. Because, again, like you mentioned, the gondola does have high visual impacts, right? 200-foot towers,
Sure.
there's no debating that. I don't disagree at all. However, the enhanced bus with peak period shoulder lanes would widen the road for the entire length of the canyon rather than at 23 discrete tower locations. So it adds more impervious surface, which is a water quality. So really, any of these alternatives are a trade-off in their environmental impacts. But I think the important thing to note is there were no threshold criteria that were surpassed in any of the 5 alternatives.
We're running a little short of time, Josh, and I just wanted to ask a couple more questions. One is have you seen an element of society, of the community that wants nothing done?
Absolutely.
Is that a big component?
It's hard to say because of the 13,000 comments we received 6,000 in the last week. So in all honesty, even the team hasn't read all of the comments.
Of course,
yet.
I understand.
But there are a component that, would prefer that nothing be done in the canyon. And I think that's not unique. I think every environmental study that's done has a contingent of people that would prefer no change.
Of course. Yeah. Well, one final question. When does the project get underway? When does construction start?
So that's a great question. What we've been saying is we hope to have a final EIS and a record of decision, right? That's the one that says what our selected alternative is in late winter, early spring of 2022. So give or take 6 months out from now. Now, that being said, we did not anticipate getting as many comments as we did. I'm so glad we got them. But like I mentioned, we haven't read all of the comments yet. And we expect that those comments are going to require changes to the draft EIS. That's why we call it a draft, right?
Of course.
So I got to put a little caveat or an asterisk on that winter 2022, because literally we don't know what we don't know yet because we just haven't had time to get through all the comments.
Would you say that there's one option that will take much longer than perhaps one of the others? I'm assuming the train option would perhaps take the longest.
They're actually all about the same, to be honest. So yeah, our construction estimates are 2 to 3 seasons for all of them. And I think a lot of people say, well, why can't you implement buses now? So I'll expand on that just for a second.
Indeed.
There, of course, is no, bus lot where you can just go buy a bus, especially because these are specialized buses with automatic chains, lower gearing, and slightly smaller than standard UTA buses.
Be kind of ordered to spec.
Exactly. And so UTA says that's 18 to 24 month procurement. And of course, you have to develop that procurement. So again, we're right there in that 2 to 3 years.
Great. Well, Josh, this has been very interesting. It sounds like you have a big task under your area of responsibility. I want to thank you very much for taking time to come in and meet with us. That concludes this episode of Stringham Real Estate Edge. Today's program is brought to you by Stringham Schools, educating real estate professionals since 1989. Visit stringhamschools.com to learn more. We want to thank today's guests, and don't forget to tell us what you think in the comments section below. I'm Gary Barnes, and I'll see you on the next episode of Stringham Real Estate Edge.